My husband planned the cruelest surprise for our anniversary dinner. He invited my parents, the ones he always mocked for being poor and uneducated, expecting them to embarrass me in front of his wealthy family. But when that Rolls-Royce pulled up and my parents stepped out, his face went completely white. If you've ever been underestimated because of where you came from, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. And if you love stories about karma and poetic justice, hit that subscribe button right now. My name is Monica, and 3 years ago, I thought I'd married the man of my dreams. Jason was charming, successful, and came from the kind of family you see in magazines. You know the type: country club memberships, vacation homes, and last names that opened doors before they even knocked. I was a corporate lawyer who'd clawed my way up from nothing. And honestly, I was so blinded by what I thought was love that I ignored every single red flag waving right in front of my face. Jason's family never approved of me. Not really. Oh, they smiled at the wedding and posed for pictures, but I could see it in his mother Margaret's eyes every time she looked at me. That tight smile that never reached her eyes. The way she'd pause just a beat too long before saying, "How nice," whenever I shared anything about my background. His father, Charles, was just as bad, always steering conversations toward pedigree and legacy, asking Jason within my earshot if he was absolutely certain about his choices. But it was the little comments from Jason himself that cut the deepest, the ones that started so subtle I almost missed them. "You hold your fork differently than my mother," he'd say with a small laugh, as if it were charming. Or, "Maybe don't mention where your parents live when we're with my colleagues." At first, I told myself he was just trying to help me fit in, but those comments became more frequent, more pointed. "It's just that my family comes from a different world, Monica. You understand, right?" My parents were Harold and Diane. Dad spent 30 years as a janitor at an elementary school. Mom worked as a seamstress, taking in alterations from our small house in Georgia. They raised me and my brother in a 3-bedroom house with linoleum floors and windows that rattled when trains passed by. We didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. My parents taught me that hard work could change your life, that education was the key that unlocked every door. And they were right. I put myself through college working 3 jobs, got into law school on a full scholarship, and graduated top of my class. But Jason's family didn't see any of that. They just saw where I came from, and after a while I started seeing it through their eyes too. I felt ashamed. Can you believe that? Ashamed of the 2 people who sacrificed everything so I could become who I was. I started making excuses for why my parents couldn't visit, why they weren't at certain events. I kept them away from my new life because I was afraid. Afraid that Jason's family would look down on them, and by extension, look down on me even more. The shame ate at me every single day. I'd call my parents and lie about why they couldn't come to Thanksgiving, why Christmas was just going to be small this year. My mother's voice would get quiet on the phone and she'd say, "We understand, baby. We know you're busy." But I could hear the hurt underneath those words, and it killed me. Still, I told myself I was protecting them, protecting myself, protecting my marriage. Then came our 3rd anniversary. Jason announced he wanted to host a big dinner at his family's favorite restaurant, this exclusive place downtown where you needed reservations 3 months in advance, and the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than my first car. He said he wanted to bring our families together finally, that he wanted to do this right. I should have known something was wrong immediately. Jason had never shown any interest in meeting my parents properly. In 3 years of marriage, he'd seen them exactly twice, once at our wedding, where he barely spoke to them, and once when they surprised us with a visit and he suddenly had to work. But he was insisting now, even pulling out his phone to call them himself before I could protest. "Harold, this is Jason, Monica's husband. Yes, sir, I know it's been too long. Listen, I'm planning a special anniversary dinner and I absolutely insist that you and Diane come. No, I won't take no for an answer. Monica would be heartbroken if you weren't there." He was using his courtroom voice, the one that sounded warm but left no room for argument. My stomach twisted into knots as I listened to him seal the deal. My parents, who I'd been keeping at arm's length for years, were now being pulled into Jason's world. I felt sick. The week leading up to the dinner was torture. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I kept imagining every horrible scenario. My dad's southern accent thickening when he got nervous. My mom's simple dress next to Margaret's designer everything. The way Jason's family would exchange those knowing looks. I thought about calling my parents to cancel, to fake an emergency, anything. But what would I say? How could I tell them the truth without breaking their hearts? Then, 3 days before the dinner, I came home early from work. Jason was in his study, door half open, talking on the phone with his brother. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I swear, but I heard my name and I just froze. Wait till you see her parents, man, Jason was saying, and there was something in his voice, something cruel. Finally, everyone's going to understand. She can stop pretending she belongs in our circle. He laughed, actually laughed, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Mom's been waiting for this. She said it's about time we all stopped pretending this marriage makes sense. Once everyone sees where Monica really comes from, maybe she'll finally accept that she married up and start acting grateful for it. I stood in that hallway, hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, and felt my entire world shatter. This wasn't about bringing families together. This was a setup. Jason had invited my parents to humiliate me, to parade them in front of his wealthy family like evidence of why I would never truly belong. And I'd been so worried about protecting them, I'd walked them straight into his trap. I thought about confronting him right then, thought about calling my parents and telling them not to come. But something stopped me. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the sudden, crystal clear realization that I'd been letting this man and his family make me feel small for 3 years. Whatever it was, I decided to let this play out. I'd face whatever Jason had planned, and I'd protect my parents with everything I had. If he wanted to humiliate me, fine. But I wouldn't let him hurt them. The night of the dinner arrived, and I felt like I was walking to my own execution. Jason had reserved the entire private dining room at La Maison, all dark wood and crystal chandeliers and waiters who moved like ghosts. His entire family was there. Margaret in head-to-toe Chanel, Charles with his country club tan, Jason's siblings and their spouses, even some cousins and business partners. It was an audience, I realized. He'd assembled an audience for my humiliation. I sat at that table in my designer dress, one Jason had bought me, I realized bitterly, and watched him check his watch every few minutes. Margaret kept shooting me these looks that might have been pity if there was any warmth in them at all. The whispers started before my parents even arrived. Are they actually coming? Can you imagine? This should be interesting. Every word felt like a knife between my ribs. Jason checked his watch again. They should be here any minute now, he said loudly, and I swear I saw him smile. Not a happy smile, a victorious one. Then we heard it. A commotion outside in the main restaurant. The valet's voice, excited. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Right away. The kind of fuss you hear when someone important arrives. The entire private room went quiet. Even the waiters stopped moving. And then I heard the maitre d's voice, respectful in a way I'd never heard before. Mr. and Mrs. Wellington, welcome to La Maison. We're honored to have you this evening. Wellington. That was my mother's maiden name. I hadn't heard anyone use it in formal address since, well, ever. The door to our private room opened, and time seemed to stop completely. A man walked in wearing a suit that I knew, even with my limited fashion knowledge, was custom-tailored. The kind of suit that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his shoes gleamed, and he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd walked into 1,000 rooms, just like this one. Behind him came a woman in an elegant navy dress that probably cost more than my wedding gown, pearls at her throat, her natural hair styled in a way that made Margaret's stiff, hair-sprayed bob look cheap by comparison. It took me a full 10 seconds to recognize them. These were my parents, Harold and Diane, the janitor and the seamstress. Except they weren't. Or they were, but they were also somehow these people I'd never seen before. The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet 3 rooms away. My father's eyes found mine across the room, and the smallest smile touched his lips. My mother's face was serene, graceful, as she took in the scene with the kind of calm assurance that comes from being absolutely comfortable in your own skin. Monica, sweetheart, my father said, his voice warm and rich without a trace of the nervousness I'd feared. He crossed the room in easy strides and pulled me into a hug that smelled like the expensive cologne that Charles wore. "Happy anniversary, baby girl." My mother kissed both my cheeks. "You look beautiful, darling. Thank you for having us." She turned to the table with a smile that was genuine and gracious. "You must be Jason's family. It's so wonderful to finally meet you all properly." I looked at Jason. His face had gone completely white. His mouth was literally hanging open. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. Charles had frozen with his wine glass halfway to his lips. The siblings were staring, and I swear Jason's brother's eyes were going to pop out of his head. My father extended his hand to Charles, who shook it automatically, still too stunned to process what was happening. "Charles, good to meet you. I've heard so much about your real estate portfolio. The development you did in Charleston? Impressive work." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Wellington, that's a beautiful bracelet. Cartier, isn't it? My wife has the matching piece." And just like that, he'd established himself as not just an equal, but as someone who moved in their world with ease. Someone who knew Cartier. Someone who kept up with Charleston real estate development. Dinner was the most surreal experience of my life. My parents settled into their seats. At the head of the table, I noticed, in the spots that Jason's parents usually claimed, and proceeded to be absolutely perfect. My father discussed market trends with Charles, mentioned a recent trip to Dubai, asked thoughtful questions about the family business. My mother complimented Margaret's dress with genuine warmth and somehow made the older woman, who'd never had a kind word for me, actually blush with pleasure. Jason kept trying to regain control of the conversation, to steer it somewhere that made sense in his planned narrative, but he was floundering. Every attempt fell flat. When he brought up simple values and humble beginnings, my father smiled and said, "Absolutely. That's why Diane and I always kept our lives modest, even after we didn't have to anymore. We wanted Monica to understand that character isn't about bank accounts. Even after we didn't have to anymore." The words hung in the air like thunder. Margaret couldn't help herself. "After you didn't have to?" My mother's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "Well, yes. Once Harold sold his patent, we could have changed everything about our lives. But we chose not to. We didn't want money to define our daughter or shield her from the real world. Patent. Sold. I felt like I was in a dream. A very confusing dream where my parents were somehow wealthy and I'd never known." The dinner continued, but the power dynamic had completely shattered. Jason's carefully planned humiliation had backfired so spectacularly that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. His family, who'd spent 3 years treating me like I'd somehow tricked Jason into marrying me, were now fawning over my parents, asking about their lovely home and their travels and their investments. When dessert was finally over, I excused myself and my parents followed me to a quiet corner near the restrooms. "Mom, Dad," my voice was shaking. "What is happening? The Rolls-Royce, the clothes, the patent. Why didn't you ever tell me?" My father took my hands in his, and they felt like the same hands that used to help me with homework at our kitchen table, even if they were now adorned with a watch that probably cost 6 figures. "Baby girl, do you remember when you were in college? Junior year?" I nodded. I invented a cleaning solution. Just a little thing I'd been working on in the garage for years. Something that worked better than anything on the market for the kind of industrial cleaning I did. I never thought much of it, but your mother convinced me to patent it. Long story short, a major company bought that patent for $3.2 million. My legs almost gave out. Mom, why didn't you tell me?" My mother's eyes were soft. "Because you were struggling through school, working so hard, and we saw how much pride you took in doing it yourself. We didn't want money to change that. We didn't want you to ever wonder if you earned your success or if our money paid for it. We wanted you to know, bone deep, that you were brilliant and capable all on your own." "We lived the same way we always did," my father continued. "We kept the same house, mostly the same life. We invested the money, helped out family quietly, set up funds for your future. But we watched you become this incredible woman who built her entire career on merit and intelligence. That was worth more than any amount of money." Tears were streaming down my face. "But why show up like this tonight? Why now?" My father's expression darkened slightly. Because your husband called us with a specific tone in his voice, the kind of tone I heard from rich folks my whole life when I was cleaning their offices. The tone that says they think they're better than you. And when you said we couldn't visit for Christmas last year, and then Thanksgiving, and then your birthday, we knew something was wrong. We knew you were ashamed of us. Dad, Hush now. We understood. We hurt, but we understood. You were trying to protect us from people who would look down on us. But baby, nobody can look down on you unless you let them. And tonight, when Jason called, I could hear it in his voice. He wasn't inviting us because he wanted to. He was setting up some kind of trap. So we decided it was time to show up and show out. To remind you where you came from. Not poverty, Monica, but strength, dignity, love. My mother wiped my tears with her thumb. We're not rich because of money, sweetheart. We're rich because we raised a daughter who became a powerhouse all on her own, who has integrity and compassion. The money, that's just paper. But you're our real treasure. I hugged them both, and something inside me that had been broken for 3 years suddenly started to heal. I thought about Jason in that dining room, watching his cruel plan fall apart. I thought about his family, who'd spent years making me feel like I wasn't good enough. And I realized something crucial. I'd been worried about the wrong thing all along. When I walked back into that dining room, my head was high. My parents followed, and the entire table looked up at us. Jason stood quickly, trying to smile, trying to pretend everything was normal. There you are. We were just... Jason, I said calmly, cutting him off. My voice was steady, clear. I heard your phone call last week, the one with your brother. His face went pale again. Monica, You planned this dinner to humiliate me. You invited my parents because you wanted your family to see where I came from. You wanted to prove to everyone that I didn't belong in your world, that I'd married up and should be grateful. I looked around the table at his family, who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Well, congratulations. You did expose something tonight, but it wasn't what you thought. Margaret started to say something, but I kept going. You exposed yourself, Jason. You showed everyone here that you're the kind of man who would try to humiliate his wife to score points with his family. The kind of man who judges people by their bank accounts and their backgrounds instead of their character. And you know what's really sad? My parents knew what you were planning, and they still showed up with grace and dignity. They could have canceled. They could have let you wallow in whatever petty satisfaction you thought you'd get. But instead, they reminded me of something I'd forgotten while trying to fit into your world. I turned to look at my parents, who stood there like pillars of strength. They reminded me that real class has nothing to do with money. Real wealth is about how you treat people, about integrity, about lifting others up instead of tearing them down. I looked back at Jason, and I felt nothing but pity. I'm filing for divorce. Not because of money, mine, yours, or my parents, but because I deserve a partner who respects me, who honors where I came from, and who would never use my family as weapons against me. I deserve someone who doesn't think love means I should be grateful that they chose to be with me. The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Margaret's face was red. Charles was staring at his plate. Jason's siblings looked everywhere except at me. And Jason. Jason just stood there, frozen, watching his plan crumble into dust. Thank you for the dinner, I said. The food was excellent, but this marriage, it's over. I walked out of that restaurant with my parents on either side of me. The valet brought the Rolls-Royce around. And yes, seeing it again still made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. As we drove away, I looked back at La Maison one last time. Through the window, I could see Jason standing alone in the parking lot, watching us leave. He'd set a trap to humiliate me, and instead, he'd trapped himself. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. Proud of you, baby. My father caught my eye in the rearview mirror. You know what the best investment I ever made was? Not that patent, not any stock or property. It was the investment your mother and I made in you, in teaching you to know your worth. Tonight, you remembered that. That's worth more than all the Rolls-Royces in the world. That was 2 years ago. The divorce was finalized within 6 months. Jason didn't even contest it. I think he was too embarrassed. Last I heard, his family still brings up that dinner in hushed, mortified tones. As for me, I'm closer to my parents than I've ever been. They still live in that same house in Georgia, though I noticed my dad finally fixed the rattling windows. I built my career even stronger, made partner at my firm, and eventually met someone who loves every part of my story, the struggle, the success, and everything in between. Someone who asked to meet my parents on our second date and who calls my dad for advice on everything from investments to how to treat me right. But here's what I really learned that night. Class isn't about money in the bank. It's not about designer clothes or fancy cars or country club memberships. Real class is about how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. It's about dignity, grace, and knowing that your worth doesn't come from someone else's validation. Jason tried to humiliate me by exposing my poor parents. Instead, he exposed the poverty of his own character. And honestly, I should thank him, because that night reminded me of something I'd lost while trying to fit into his world: the knowledge that I came from royalty. Not the kind with crowns and titles, but the kind with integrity, strength, and unconditional love. That's the kind of wealth that never runs out. If this story reminded you that karma is real and that you can't humiliate someone who knows their worth, smash that like button. Subscribe, because I share real stories about real people who refuse to be broken by judgment and prejudice. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been underestimated because of where you came from? How did you prove them wrong? I read every single one, and I want to hear your story. Now, watch the next video on your screen. You won't believe what happens when someone tries to judge based on appearances and gets the shock of their life. Remember, your background is your foundation, not your ceiling. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that.